Welcome everyone to our Q&A session this evening on masking with Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate. I'm Sarah from the Autism Apprentice, and my colleague Donna is also with us this evening. I'd just like to say a really big thank you, Kieran, for doing this evening for us. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself, Kieran?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. This is the bit I always hate. I have to write it down.
Sorry.
Because I won't be able to say it otherwise. I'm reading off of a Word document right now. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2003, and I am parent to 3 children, 2 of whom have an autism diagnosis. I am a published mainstream and academic author and international public speaker, and you can see my writing at theautisticadvocate.com. I have a background in SEND education and service delivery for autistic children and adults. I deliver my own specialist training to professionals, parents, carers, and autistic people, and I provide private consultancy to charities and organisations around the world. I've lectured at universities across the UK. I am a peer reviewer for the academic journal Autism in Adulthood, and I am an honorary associate researcher for Sunderland University, and I have several published academic papers.
Wow. That is why we are over the moon, Kieran, that you're trying to agree to do this for us this evening.
And that's why I'm very tired, Sarah.
I've got plenty of caffeine to the side of me this evening.
This is Coke, so.
2 cans to the side of me.
Oh. And I'm just on the coffee.
There you go. So we've been promoting this session and we have received a great response actually, and hopefully we've got some good questions from both professionals and also families. So shall we make a start, Donna?
Yeah, so good evening everyone. So the first question is a nice straightforward one, Kieran, but what is masking? Could you explain to us all, please?
It's actually, I could give you an easy answer and I could give you a complex one. I'll start with the easy bit. Masking is something that everybody does because we all do something called context switching, which is when you're in different situations with different people, you act a little bit differently, you project a little bit differently. Like if you are with your mum or dad, you might be different to how you are with your friends or your work colleagues. So that's kind of adaptive morphing, that's context switching. When we're talking about masking, autistic masking particularly, we're talking about taking that to the next level, because the extra bits that are attached onto that are all trauma responses. So when we talk about an autistic person masking, we're talking about a psychological safety mechanism, which is triggered through trauma. So over time, that could be suppressing sensory differences. That could be suppressing when people invalidate you over the way that you communicate, your behavior, or your sensory differences. And over time, it builds up and builds up and builds up. And what ends up happening is that eventually you're not really you anymore. You're this person that just projects whatever is acceptable to other people. The sociologist Webb Du Bois back in the early 20th century looked at racialized oppression in the United States. And he came up with this term called double consciousness, which describes what Black people feel when they're around white people, that they project another version of themselves. And eventually over time, that's the one that takes control. So when I talk about autistic masking, obviously racism is a very, very, very different thing and much more problematic to the things that happen generally to autistic people. But very, very similar things occur over time. You find that autistic people who mask, who project this acceptable version of themselves, they forget that they're doing it. It becomes an unconscious act and you lose who you are underneath that, which is why you get so many autistic adults who, once they realize that they're autistic and the mask starts to crumble and fall off, they're very, very terrified that they don't know who they are underneath, that there's just this void underneath them. And that's something that starts really, really early on in childhood, and it just goes and goes and goes as you get older and older. So that's the nutshell version.
Yeah, that was really detailed for a nutshell version.
Oh, yeah, there's a much more complex version.
Yeah, we'll save that one for another day. We'll go for a level 2. So is it just autism, Kieran, that that you can mask? Just hearing from what you've said, people maybe with a trauma response possibly, or ADHD and other, neurodivergent conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just an autistic thing. Obviously, there are specific things that contribute to an autistic person who masks, but it's really more a marginalized behavior. So if you look at other groups, like I said, black people who undergo racialized oppression, gay people talk about having the closet. These are very, very similar terminologies and very, very similar actions. And it's all about kind of adapting and changing who you are to please other people, and also not get singled out, not get treated differently because of who you are. So, so no, it's not just an autistic thing at all. It's possible. A lot of professionals I've heard so many professionals, when referring to ADHD children in particular, say, well, you can't mask ADHD. Oh, yes, you can. It is possible, absolutely possible. But one thing really important to remember in this narrative is that there's a lot of victim blaming goes on with masking. It's like, well, they were hiding from us. They're concealing who they are, and, they're not showing us their true selves, so therefore we can't identify them. When in actual fact, much of what's blamed on masking is actually the fault of the people around them, who aren't educated enough to identify and don't have the knowledge to kind of back up and be able to see the things that they need to see. So it's really, really important to remember that bit as well, because it's too easy to dismiss the victim when in actual fact, it's the system around them that's the problem.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And thinking just as we go through this evening, I think we've had some questions that are very similar around that. So it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on those. So we hear a lot from parents, obviously that's where our work is based, but it's also portrayed in the media that masking is generally just seen in girls. Now, we've got boys ourselves, and we speak to many, many clients who have boys who also are very, very capable of masking. But what can we do to change that perception, do you think? Yeah, I know. It's a loaded question, isn't it?
Really, there's two parts of that question, and I think I need to explain why it's seen as a girl thing first before, if that's okay.
Yeah, no.
I'm not going to interfere with any kind of future ones. The reason that masking is seen as a girl thing is because there are lots and lots of autistic people who were identified as female at birth who weren't seen as being autistic. And the reason that they weren't seen as being autistic is because we have an utterly sexist narrative around autism. It was very much from Asperger and from Kanner right back from the very beginning, mostly focused on white boys who presented in a particular way, not even just white boys who presented in a particular way. And that's where our understanding of autism has really come from. And it's stayed that way all the way through. And a lot of this is misconceptions around socialization, because autistic girls are socialized differently girls are socialized differently to boys. There are expectations around how women are supposed to act, the things women are supposed to do, the colors women are supposed to like, the toys that women are supposed to play with, and much of it is actually framed around being a housewife. So there's that problematic narrative. So when your mask presents that way, as in, I become very serious about my housework, or when I line things up, I don't line up boy things because I line up clothes, or I line up the dolls that I've been given to play with and I'm expected to play with. Those things are then easily missed. So it's not so much around that girls do it better, it's that often girls do it differently because of the way that they have been socialized. I have to be really careful around that girl narrative as well, because obviously we are now at a time where we are seeing so many different genders and understanding gender in a very different way. So I'm not excluding anyone by saying that. It's more people that are assigned female at birth. But that narrative has also excluded many autistic boys and many non-binary people and trans people who don't present as typically autistic, who don't match the diagnostic criteria in the way that it's been designed to see. And obviously the same thing applies to lots of people who are assigned female at birth as well. So actually, I think if we could identify every autistic person in the world, you would find there's actually equal numbers, boys, girls, non-binary people, trans people, who all project in different ways, but their masks might appear slightly differently depending on how they present. And that's a really important kind of thing to remember there as well. It's kind of, it's not a girl thing at all. And there are really, really problematic narratives around why it's become that way. But with the disclaimer that autistic women and girls have been missed completely from this narrative and need all the attention that they can get. But creating new myths is not the way to go about it. And that's what's currently happening. And it's really...
Yeah, that's really interesting, particularly taking into account, as you correctly said, Kieran, about the, people who identify, at birth. Yeah, that's really, really important. I think that's a really valid point. We find in our work that we're speaking to more and more and more people who are, transgender, non-binary, etc. So it is about the presentation, isn't it? And I think that's got to be the baseline.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Kieran, one of the questions we've received is, are the traits different for boys than girls?
Is this masking traits or is this autistic traits? Or
masking. Sorry,
no, that's fine. That's a really hard question to answer because everybody's completely different. And that's the problem. But so if you go back to what I said earlier about much of this narrative around masking is actually what the services around people aren't seeing rather than what is being projected. I think that's part of the problem. So I think people expect that girls will present in particular ways, when in actual fact, that's not always the case at all. You could have an autistic girl that's singing and dancing autistic and very obviously autistic, but the narratives around that might dismiss her because of sexism and because of this sexist narrative that we have. So you do find that lots of autistic women and girls go through this kind of gauntlet of mental health diagnoses. So borderline personality disorder, bipolar, depression, all of those kind of things. ADHD has become a new one that's stuck in there now at the moment. And it is kind of like you have to jump those hoops before you eventually get to where you need to be, which is the autism diagnosis, or at least identifying that they're autistic so that they can start supporting themselves in better ways. So it's not that girls have different traits because, we're all individual human beings, first of all. That's a really important thing to remember. So different things make us up who we are in terms of identity, our upbringings, who our parents are, how we were brought up, where we went to school, the things that we learned, the relationships that we have with people. All those things make us who we are, along with a lot of other things as well. But particularly for autistic people, there are so many co-occurring conditions that go along with being autistic, things that are standalone things, but also things that are attached to us as well sometimes. I've identified over 100. So that's pretty much 50-50 in terms of things that could be present from birth, but the other 50% are around mental health problems and things as well. So if you've got all that going on, but the only things that are ever recognized in you is autism, maybe ADHD, maybe some dyspraxia or dyslexia, and then that's it. But there's another 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 things that could possibly be going on. Of course, your traits, whatever they may be, are going to look a little bit differently compared to other people. And then if you throw in the mix, like I said before, the way that you've been socialized and all those things, it's all going to play a part in how you present as an autistic person. And much of that isn't even autism. It's nothing to do with being autistic. It's other things going on that are interacting with your autistic neurology. So no, there are no different traits between boys and girls, but there are different traits between different individual people.
Yeah. No, we get asked this a lot actually, when we speak to families, is they'll have a young person and they're masking at school. And obviously when they come home, they've got to let it all out. And it's, how do we deal with the meltdowns when our young person gets home from school, when they've been masking all day?
The difficulty there is that if the meltdown's going to happen, it's going to happen. and you have to let it happen. You have to make sure that they are safe and the other people around them are safe, and that they can release all of this pent up suppression that they have been experiencing all day long. Otherwise, the alternative is that they bottle it up and they keep it in them, which is a much more dangerous thing, especially if that goes on over the course of years. Like with any meltdown, the best things that you can do is safety, space, and time. So don't talk to them, don't try and engage with them, just let them do what they need to do. As long as they are not at danger of seriously hurting themselves, just let it come out. The problem is not the meltdown. The problem is the reason for the masking and the meltdown, which is the school environment, which, without trying to kind of annoy any teachers that may be present, school is an awful place for autistic children, an absolutely awful place. And that's a sweeping generalized statement, but the majority of the time that's absolutely true. You are in an environment which is sensorially a nightmare all of the time. Where your natural form of communication is not allowed, where your natural form of behavior is not allowed, where the way that you need to move, the way that you need to think, the way that you need to feel, the way you need to learn, all those things you are not allowed to do. So you are spending the whole day literally doing this and clinging on and being tight and rigid. Now, that's happening on the inside. On the outside, it might project very differently, like I mentioned earlier. It might be that the acceptable version of you is what is expected of you. So if you are a child that's been tagged as a behavioral problem, then your mask might present as throwing out challenging behavior, as people like to term it. It might be that you fawn and people please, and you're the teacher's pet and you want to do everything to please the teacher all day long. It might be that you're the quiet one that sits in the corner and doesn't cause any problems. It could project in all those different ways. So no matter how that happens, you are using up so much mental and physical and emotional energy to be able to keep sustaining that throughout the day. And then you get home, or you get to the school gate and you find your safe person, whether that's mum, dad, whoever's picking you up, or they take you to a safe place, which is home or wherever. And because you feel safe, you can release all that pent up horribleness can all get released, and the exhaustion all comes flooding out. Now, there are some children that doesn't happen to, like I mentioned, who go through their school lives and mask all day long and then come home and for whatever reason, don't quite feel comfortable or safe at home to be able to release all that energy. And then that's a very, very different narrative. But all of that then leads into things like autistic burnout, which I think we're going to come to a bit later with some questions. But yeah, so I've forgotten what the question was. I've talked for so long.
It was how to deal with meltdowns, and I think you have answered that, Kieran. And what's reassuring for us is that we are actually giving the same advice as you've just said. There's one other thing we say, and that's try not to place any demands on them for the first hour or so. So,
you know, actually longer than that, I would say. Oh yeah. If you think about any situation where you have become dysregulated and overwhelmed, and I'm talking about anyone now, your heart beats faster, the adrenaline pumps around your body. When you are in that state of anxiety, and it's really, again, it's trauma. When you are being traumatized and this is your response to it, you are having so many different hormones pumped into your bloodstream, and they can hang around for anything between like 1 to 2 days. So you can re-trigger in that post-meltdown period at any point really quite easily. It dissipates over a period of time. So just to be kind of conscious and aware of that, you know, and obviously that first post-meltdown hour is really, really important, because that's usually the time when any autistic person is at their most vulnerable. That's usually the time when they start talking about self-harm, when they start beating themselves up and berating themselves and saying how awful they are. And, you know, all those things start to come tumbling out at that point. So that's why it's really important not to make demands at that during that period, and just offer reassurance and safety. But after that, for the next day or two, just be conscious that things can re-trigger really, really easily through that period, simply because of the amount of dysregulation that's still going on and the amount of adrenaline and all those different hormones that are still within their blood system.
Brilliant. That's really useful, Kieran. And the other point, we support a lot of families where obviously their children are masking at school. School are not seeing it. And so it's making it difficult for them to get the diagnosis. So when they send the papers out, obviously the parents fill it out and then school fill it out.
Yeah.
And obviously they're poles apart.
Contrast, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, we've had several people contact us with this question. How do you get a diagnosis for a child that masks really well and school aren't seeing it?
If I had a magic wand.
Yeah, I know.
Because this isn't something that any parent really can have much control over. And that's really hard for me to say. That there is nothing that I can tell you that's going to magically make things better, because the issue here is that you have a service that knows that schools don't have the training and education to be able to recognize any autistic child within their within the school building, but still relies on school report to be able to put them forward for a diagnosis. Yeah. So it's a really, really, really massive problem that we have failing services and failing schools. And that's not me being disparaging about services or schools. You neither are supported in the right way, neither are funded enough, neither are given the right training or educational support to be able to do their jobs properly. They're doing the best that they can, but parents and autistic children are stuck and trapped within the middle of that. And this is why sometimes you get these narratives around kind of parents being accused of things like FII and stuff like that. And all of the, you know, there's very easy parent blame, or it's the child that's the problem, and then it's the parent that's not bringing the child up properly, because these services aren't educated well enough to be able to recognize these narratives and recognize the children that they need to recognize in the way that they need to do it. So all I can say is that if you, as from a parent perspective, as a parent myself, I always work really, really hard to have the best relationship that I can with schools. With my children's schools, that's worked sometimes. It hasn't worked at other times. You know, even as someone I'm not an expert by any means, don't think anybody is, but as someone who's a professional that's worked in this field for a long time, I still, when I walk into school, I'm still dad. That's what schools see me as. And I've been told that very clearly by some schools. And, you know, you leave your professional expertise at the doors because we're the professionals now. So when you are butting up against those narratives, it's really, really difficult. So having that relationship with school is utterly key. And sometimes it's not having relationship with the whole school or the head teacher or the Senko. Sometimes it might be a teaching assistant that you need that relationship with, just to give you that little bit of an in, to have someone on your side who's going to fight your corner with you. So, you know, so it's obviously in the time that we're living in at the moment, that's really difficult, because having relationships with school staff is really hard, which adds to those factors. But this is why I think, and this has happened to myself as well with one of my kids, this is why so many parents are taking kids out of school now and home educating, simply because of these reasons, that it's so difficult to have a level, equal relationship with a school when you are a parent. It's really, really hard. There are barriers there, systemic barriers that are in place, and they need to be removed. So all we can do is keep working together to keep these conversations going and make sure that those changes happen.
And, you know, that again is really interesting, because Donna and we say the same. It's about building that relationship up with schools. And now, speaking as a parent with my daughter, the difference when they're in the right environment and the staff are highly experienced and trained, and, you know, they get it, you know, you have a different young person. It's amazing when you get the right environment. Oh, Donna,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. I've just seen we've had a question come in on the chat, Kieran. Do you think teaching a child to be social inhibits the diagnosis?
To a degree, probably yes. I have a huge issue with social skills training, massive issue with it. And the issue that I have with it is that I see autistic people and non-autistic people as two different cultures. So if you imagine you are taken out of your country and you're plonked in a foreign country where nobody speaks your language, where the body language is different, the hand signals are different, the gestures are different, the intonation and the meaning of words are different. Now, this can happen. You can go to other countries and live in those other countries, and there is an expectation that you learn the culture, that you learn to speak the language, and that you recognize body language and signals and all of those kind of things. And that's fair enough. But when you move to other countries, there is not an expectation that you stop using your own language ever again. There's not an expectation that you don't use your innate body language ever again, that you lose all forms of communication that you did before and do naturally, and you have to adhere to that country's new. I mean, that's probably something that happens here in Britain, but it doesn't happen in other countries, you know? So it's, if you use that example, when you have an autistic child who, we know through research now that there is innate autistic culture, there's innate autistic communication styles, innate language, innate behaviors, innate body languages, all those things exist independently within autistic children. So as they grow up, they are taught not to use any of those skills. Those things are wrong. We're pathologized by the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we move, the way that we talk, the things that we eat, the way that we eat, how we sleep, all those things are pathologized. So we're told not to use any of that in social skills, and we're told that we have to behave like non-autistic people. We have to do the things that non-autistic people do. And when we do that, all we're doing is encouraging masking, because no autistic person is a non-autistic person. We are two very, very similar. We're human beings, but we do have neurologies that work differently. That's a cold, hard fact. You know, that's why we behave the way that we do. It's why we talk the way that we do and all those things. So if there is that cultural divide and you have one big culture saying to the other one, no, you have to do everything the way that we say you do, that's really, really problematic. And of course, it's going to mean that when someone goes for a diagnosis, because they've been taught to mask, because they've been encouraged to do it, because they've had to do it through safety, then they're not going to get recognized. The other problem with the diagnostic criteria is there isn't really an autism diagnostic criteria. It's a criteria for very, very stressed autistic people who are in some kind of crisis. So that's the other problem with it as well. So, you know, it's about recognizing these narratives. Now, if social skills training was also applied to non-autistic people who were taught how autistic people communicate, how autistic people move, if the same things were taught, so there was some kind of balance and then a meeting in the middle, some kind of translation, then absolutely, yes, I would be a fan of it. But I'm not, because all the onus is put on the autistic child to change. And then the result is that we are not identified as autistic because we've done what you've told us to do.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Almost like a conformist society, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So, I mean, in your opinion then, Kieran, do you think that masking should be part of a diagnostic criteria?
I think that diagnosticians and diagnostic services need to be more aware and understanding of their limitations and their lack of understanding. I think there needs to be much more. The problem is that we have this 100 years of autism history, right back through earlier than Asperger, going back to, her name's flown out of my head, the Ukrainian lady back in the 1920s who was identifying autistic people back then, Grunya Sakharova. So we have this 100 years of history, and autistic people haven't been a part of it. We've been absolutely excluded from it. Everything is observation, it's from a behavioralist point of view, and it's external. Now, in the last 4, 5, 6 years, really, more and more autistic people have been engaged in research in terms of co-production, being the researchers ourselves, and steering the narratives from our own sense of internal, we know what's going on, and you need to stop telling us what's going on in us because we're the ones who know. And that's shifted things now. So the research that's now coming off the back of, starting to come off the back of that, is much more focused on autistic wants and needs, on how autistic people work and all of those kind of things. So I think that's part of the problem, is that we have been excluded for so long from this narrative that services are framed around this idea of what autism is that isn't autism at all, that isn't anything to do with autistic people. It's just this thing that people have made up that they've stuck over in the corner, and, you know, they've decided this is it, this is what we're going to talk about. And because of certain people, there's been a lot of talk about a certain person in the last few weeks, certain people who are very famous and very respected and have been at the top for a very long time, because people make careers out of this. They sell books off the back of it, and the cultural narrative changes to morph towards whatever these people are saying. And then all of a sudden we realize that actually, no, that's completely wrong. So we need to change that. But it's too late because it's already out there. It's already embedded in services. I mean, most services, particularly in the UK, I don't know if there's people from abroad here, but in the UK, most like CAMS, SIPs, things like that, the level of training usually, from my experience, is usually something around 2005. That's where we are in terms of people's education, when in actual fact, you've got so many autistic people working on the forefront of, we're in 2030, we're ahead of the game. So it's really, really, all these narratives are so hard. And again, it's autistic children, it's families who are caught up in the mix of all this. And it's horrendous, absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, and you've kind of answered the next question that had come in there, Kieran. No, I'm impressed. Go for it. In fact, you've answered the next two, really. It was, the question that came in, should masking be part of training for professionals, particularly teachers? But I don't think it is just particularly teachers. I think it's anyone who has contact.
Yeah, absolutely. It's every professional that engages in autistic people in any way, shape or form need to be aware of these narratives. And that's the problem. I mean, like, I worked in education for a long time, and I know if there's any teachers watching, I'm not disparaging teachers whatsoever, because I know how difficult your jobs are. But I also know that your training is awful, especially when it comes to disability, and particularly when it comes to autism. The autism training is terrible if it exists at all. And usually the training, I've sat through so many teacher training days where someone's come in and has done autism training. It's generic, it's stereotyped, it's tick box, and it's not useful. It's, it might as well have not happened at the end of the day, because all you're going to do is create a stereotype. And that teacher goes out then with a stereotype in their head of, this is what I need to do to help the autistic people within my school. When in actual fact, as we've already established, all the autistic people within your school are completely different. You probably don't even know that 95% of them are there. So, this is the problem. All of this needs to be unpicked and reframed. And everybody engaging with autistic people need to understand these narratives, particularly professionals.
We've got a huge task in front of us, haven't we? Everybody.
Yeah, it's momentous, and it's. Yeah. If you look at it as a civil rights movement, if you compare it to kind of where gay people were, back from the 60s through to now kind of thing, I think we're still kind of 40, 50, 60 years behind their kind of movement in terms of that. The disability movement has been around longer than the autism, civil rights movement. We've got such a long way to go. And what scares me is that we have, all the concepts that we're talking about now, things like neurodiversity and stuff like that, have all come from within the autistic community. These are all autistic ideas, but neurodiversity isn't just about autism. It's about other things as well, ADHD, bipolar. You can have acquired neurodivergencies like traumatic brain injuries and dementia and stuff like that. But none of those different things get the publicity that autism does. So we're further ahead than so we've got such a huge responsibility here to keep the momentum going and pull along as many people as we can, because there is so much that needs changing. It's like, seriously, sometimes I get out of the bed in the morning and I think I just need to get back in again because it's too overwhelming. But if I thought like that, and if other people thought like that, we wouldn't be anywhere and we'd be stuck. And I have seen fundamental change in about the last 3-4 years. We keep hitting these series of like tipping points, but then somebody pops up like Sir Professor Baron Cohen with his special study, and then that just wipes the floor. It sets us back. It's like, it feels like 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. So we just need to keep going, and it's difficult and it's hard. But if we stop, then that's it. It's over.
Absolutely.
I see we have some questions on the chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the questions that people have communicated with us previously, because they got in touch first, and then we'll go through the ones on the chat.
Sure.
But just tagging on to what you've just said, Kieran, it's really interesting because I know different local authorities. I know in Kent, they're looking at investing and trying to support families that care for a young person with autism. But one of the things that is included in that is the Signet program for families. So that's interesting with what you've just said. I'll leave it there.
Would you like me to comment on the Signet program?
You can have
Yes,
your own voice, Kieran.
I would.
I don't want to get you two in any trouble.
Oh, we're always in trouble, Kieran.
I think I hear so many services that use Signet and then tell me that they've had to adapt it. And then I think, why did you buy it in the first place? You know, if you've had to change something to drag it up to your level of knowledge, which with all due respect isn't high enough, where's the value in it in the first place? And again, it's like one of those things, like I was saying with the teacher training, it's really stereotypical. There's a lot of people wouldn't recognize how much box ticking and how generic it is and how problematic a lot of the themes in it are and how ableist it is as well, because it is really, really ableist. And how it's not helping families. And families will go away from it and feel probably, I hear a lot of parents that come away from Signet training and are like, you know, oh, that was really useful. I found that really, really useful. But imagine how useful it would be if it was projected 20 years on with much better knowledge in it and how more beneficial it would be to you. And I think part of the problem is as well with things like Signet is that, you know, you get your, I was going to say your child gets a diagnosis. Children don't get diagnoses. Parents get the diagnosis. Children are just left out of the equation completely. So the parent is handed this diagnosis. They're expected to explain it to the children, often don't know how to do that, so don't even do it, and think then, you know, it's introduced negatively to them, it's handed to them in a negative way. You have your cultural knowledge of autism, which is really negative, and probably still things like Rain Man and atypical and stuff like that, all of those kind of stereotypical things. And it's all really, really negative. And then you have to wait 6 months and you're put on this course. Of course, it's going to feel useful, because it's slightly better than everything else you've been given before. And it feels like it might give you some answers, but then you're still grasping. It's still not enough. And then you're just left to get on with it. And you're then expected to deal with schools who, again, aren't educated properly and supported properly. And you're expected to proactively advocate for a child around something that you don't even really understand yourself. That's immensely problematic. If I had my way, there would be knowledgeable autistic people standing on the steps of every CAMS and SIPs in the UK, waiting for parents to come out to put their arm around them and then just take them away and say, look at all this wonderful stuff here that can really help you.
I mean, I have to say, from a personal point of view, I feel what Donna and I do now, and that is, you know, well, it's a 2-to-1, if you like, with the family. And we try and break it down because, as we said right at the beginning of this, we are all individuals. So, in my opinion, how can a program help everyone that's generic? Donna and I try and break it down. We don't know everything. Obviously, no one does. No. But we, you know, we've got the lived experience. Everyone in our team's got lived experience, and we learn every single day. When we speak to autistic people, that's how we learn. So
you guys are honest around that as well, Sarah, that you don't know everything and you don't have all the answers. And that's really, really important, because when parents go to, you are professionals, but when parents go to kind of service professionals, that there is, I know everything, I'm the professional, I'm the one with the answers, you know, so that veil is there. There's that divide between the parent and the professional there, whereas you guys cross that divide because you are parents as well, and you're engaged in these narratives, and you do listen to autistic people and want to learn, and you want that insight because it helps you and you know it's meaningful. And what lots of services provide, unfortunately, isn't meaningful or productive. And this is why with my own training, there is no such thing as autism training. You cannot train on autism at all unless you're going to fall into generic stereotypes And that doesn't work because there's millions of us around the planet who are very different for very, very different reasons. But with my training, I don't train on autism. I train on reframing people's understanding of autism and the narratives around autism, which then equips them to go out and make steps themselves and figure out the way themselves. It's like arming them with tools that they never had before. And that's what I try to do for people, for parents and professionals. And that's the only way you can change things, because you can't train on millions of people. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Could you train on being black? Could you train on being gay? Could you train on anything? You can't do that. You can't train about human beings because we're the most complex creatures on the planet. All you can do is help people to understand that there are problematic narratives currently and strip that away and put new things in place to help them. It's like taking the scales off their eyes, you know. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then once you see, you can't unsee, and that makes life even harder.
Oh, now another question. The answer. What's the ultimate price for masking what's likely to happen?
The ultimate prize. This has been talked about in the autistic community for decades. It's very well known, and it's just in the last couple of years starting to be recognized in research now that there is a fundamental link between masking and the high rate of suicide amongst autistic people. If you think about if you take aside epilepsy, our biggest killers are suicide and heart attacks. So both of them are results of stress. So you are living a traumatized, stressed life, and masking generally is a huge part of that narrative. So there are now direct questions. In between that, you have autistic burnout, though, usually. So there's a step there that's not quite been recognised yet, but research is now showing. Sarah Cassidy at Nottingham has researched this to the nth degree, and one of the biggest indicators of suicide amongst autistic people was autistic masking. So these narratives are now starting to be recognised, but that's the big prize. And I do have to say, masking in itself is not a fundamentally bad thing, because it is a form of self-protection. So the alternative to masking usually is to be bullied, invalidated, to be treated badly, usually it's there protecting. It's when the mask takes over and it's there all of the time and it becomes that trauma response, that's when it becomes problematic, and that's when it's really, really hard to shift. And that's the bit where you lose sight of you actually doing it. It just becomes your day-to-day. So in itself, masking is a tool because it keeps us safe. And if you can have control over that tool, you can enter certain environments knowing that you're going to be unsafe in that environment. And you can do what the current research narrative thinks masking is, put it on your face, enter a social situation, and then take it back off again. That's what research thinks masking is currently. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to change in research. So if we can get to that stage where people are supported to be authentic and they are supported to have autonomy and they are independent and able to self-understand the narratives around them and understand their sensory experiences and understand where is safe and where is not safe, then masking becomes a tool which you can use to keep you safe. But when it's not, when it's got control of you, that's where we end up down this narrative of poor mental health and suicide and all of those horrible things.
Sort of leads on to the next one from parent. How do parents deal with the burnout and help their child recover, particularly as waiting lists are long and mental health services have limited capacity? And obviously what we're seeing, Kieran, I expect it's the same throughout the UK, is since COVID, I mean, it was long waiting times and stretched resources anyhow prior to the pandemic, but the situation is quite grim from what we're seeing. Yeah.
I think I have an issue with relying on mental health services anyway. Lots of parents, I see this all the time, hear this all the time, that parents are, I've got a 6 months, 2 years, whatever waiting list to go and see CAMS. And then when they get there, their child's rejected because they're autistic. So that's usually the narrative that happen, or it's too complex. We can't deal with this. We're not equipped to deal with this. And the reason for that is that CAMS shouldn't be dealing with autistic people. They're not the right place. Autism isn't a mental health condition. Firstly, it's not a condition at all. But it's definitely not a mental health condition, and it's also not something that they have been supported, funded, and educated enough in to be able to deal with. And also, when you think about CAMS have huge turnovers of psychologists and psychiatrists, massive turnovers going on there. General day-to-day staff, huge turnovers, and that's because of how stressful it is working within CAMS systems. And then you've got the pandemic on top of that, which just makes things, the resources are just gone. So this obviously, I haven't even got to the question yet, but this reliance and hope that there is some kind of service out there that's going to be you're going to be able to take your child to it, and they're going to say, oh yes, we know exactly what's going on, we're going to support your child, and there's going to be a wonderful shiny outcome at the end of it. Unfortunately, that is not the world that we live in, and that again is really hard for me to say and probably really hard to hear, but we are reliant on services that aren't equipped to support us, and that's the problem. So on top of that, when you do have a child in burnout, again, I mean, from personal experience, from working with so many people that have been in burnout, and it's not just something that just goes away. It's once you're in it, it's too late to a degree. You're in it, and there's no quick fix. There's no quick coming out of it. And what you need is time. What you need is space. What you need is decompression. What you need is as few demands as possible. What you need is the ability to reassert yourself and for your body and brain to come out of this protective shell that it's gone into. If you think about it like a mobile phone battery. So when you have a mobile phone, you get your lovely new shiny mobile phone, and you charge it once and it lasts for days, and the battery lasts for days, and it's wonderful. And then gradually over time, every time you charge it, it doesn't last as long. And then it gets to the point where you have to have the thing plugged in all the flipping time, because it never, the battery just drains. And if you've got an Apple, that lasts about 2 weeks from when you bought it. But, but this is a very similar kind of thing to what's going on with autistic burnout, because we never get the opportunity to recharge properly. There is an element of burnout that happens every day. And then you get up the next morning and you haven't fully recharged as much as you had the day before. So you're already starting on a slightly more depleted battery. So day after day that goes to, and then you get to the weekend, and then, all you want to do is stare at a screen. All you want to do is sit in your pants. You don't want to go anywhere. You don't want to do anything. You want to hide under a blanket. All those things are narratives that I'm sure the parents here will recognize. And the reason for that is that that's the autistic brain and body trying to re-energize itself, because it knows that there's another 5 days here where we're going to have to do stuff. And it's stuff that's going to be really taxing and really hard, and there might be masking involved, and that's going to drain the resources. So over time, if you add that up over weeks and months, and you get to the point where you just can't charge that battery. No matter what you do, that battery does not charge. And how that looks in autistic children often is what we like to term school refusal. And it's not school refusal. There is no such thing as school refusal. It's school-induced anxiety or school-induced trauma, because they are being put day to day in an environment which is not supportive, which doesn't work properly, which at the very least doesn't even match their learning style, regardless of all the other things that are going on. So all that is happening, and then by the time your child has reached that point, or they're curled up in a ball in the shower and can't get up, or they're in bed and when you try and wake them up, they just roll over and they refuse to move, or they're rigid, and all of those things are going on. And I'm sure there are parents here that recognize this. That's autistic burnout. And what that isn't is a mental health problem. It's not depression. Anxiety is wrapped up in that, of course, absolutely it's wrapped up in it, but there's no depression there. Depression comes a bit later on. Depression comes when you're forced to drag them out of bed, when you have to put the demands on them because the services and systems around us tell us that we have to put the demands on them, and then threaten us with fines and imprisonment if we don't do those things. So, and then all of these other narratives then spin off. But then what you have is a child that is aware that they can't do the things that are being asked of them, but then they also know that's adding extra pressure to their parents, that their parents are now feeling that frustration and feeling that anxiety. And when anybody that knows an autistic, but actually knows an autistic person, I'm not talking about, again, people like Mr. Baron Cohen, knows that actually the empathy thing is arse about face, it's back to front, that we are like emotional sponges that suck up emotional energy from other people. So autistic kids will know intrinsically and intuitively when their parents are frustrated, when their parents are anxious, when their parents are worried, and they will know when they are the source of that anxiety and frustration and worry. So you as a parent will not be blaming your children. I know that won't be happening. You won't be berating them and being horrible to them and forcing them to do things because you think they should and all of those kind of things. But the child will take on the narrative that that's what's going on, that you do blame them and that they're the fault, they're the problem, when in actual fact, they're not the fault at all. And when we use terms like school refusal, that's victim blaming. That's saying the child's refusing to do what they are told. They are making a choice. They've got no choice by this point. It's too difficult and it's too hard. So when I've got like a list of what burnout looks like, what it counts, some of the things it can look like, and it's very long. I won't read all of it. But it's things like growing lethargy. These are kind of some of them are flags, the indicators that, well, that's where you're heading, and some of them you're in the thick of it. So when you know that they're getting more lethargic, when they're more irritable than normal, when you notice their anxiety is going up, or they're quicker to flash into things like anger and stress and upset and those kind of things. When they're reacting more to the sensory environment in negative ways. So things that maybe they weren't a problem before and now a problem. The TV's too loud, or they need their music up higher than they've ever had it before, and things like that, those kind of things. When their communication levels start to diminish, and you might find that they start using things like text and WhatsApp and things more and more as a way to communicate with you. When things like meltdowns and shutdowns start to gradually increase, and they're happening more and more, and it's obviously more noticeable if you've got a child that's fairly well regulated usually. When they're less able to kind of explain their emotions and identify what's going on with them. For some autistic kids, that's a normal thing, but for others, it's a less normal thing. So it's when that inability to kind of convey how they're feeling increases. Things like brain fog, forgetting things like executive dysfunction can get worse or become more apparent, like losing stuff all the time and not knowing where things are, and then getting frustrated around that really easily. And again, that frustration getting more and more. Things like narrowing of thinking. So rigidity becomes more apparent, like not wanting to be able to change their mind about things, or if you offer too many choices, those things just trigger a whole kind of series of disasters. Not being able to get momentum, so not having inertia, so not being able to start things, and when they do start things, very, very easily kind of slipping away and not being able to concentrate on those things and stuff like that. And then if you notice, if you've got a child that stims, obviously, you might notice that stimming becomes more apparent and maybe more frenetic, because they're reaching, their body's kind of like wanting sensory input that's going to help them and re-energize them, but they can't quite get there. So I mean, there's lots more. I can send you the list, and maybe you could send it out to people or something, but
that would be really useful.
There's so much going on now, and the problem is that if you have an autistic teen who's going through puberty, some of these things can be masked by that as well, and that's why it's really important with things like burnout as well, to make sure that if you think you've got a child in burnout, make sure that you've kind of looked at the medical side of things as well, and make sure there's nothing else going on there, because sometimes it can mask medical conditions and stuff like that, because they can present in similar ways. But when you're in the middle of all of this, especially if you don't know what's going on, you're not depressed. You are absolutely confused, because today you can't do things that yesterday you could.
Yeah.
And that gets worse and worse. So when we have these narratives around things like regression, regression is a word that's thrown around autistic children a lot of the time. And actually, I have this theory, and there's a lot of academics who are kind of looking into this now, that regression is not a thing amongst autistic people, especially when you've got young children who, when parents are talking about, well, they could speak and now they can't speak and things like that. I think it's burnout in very, very, very young children. So you notice when things like this happen, usually it's around times of when socialization changes, things like introduction to preschool, childminders, nursery, those kind of things. It's those big things. And then this is where the conflation with things like MMR and vaccines causing autism came in, because those things happen at times of socialization.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a skills loss there. And it's not something that does happen overnight, but it can feel like it happens overnight. So you have all these narratives intertwining. And I really think that that's what's going on. Because if you think you might have heard me talk about this before, but we never talk about autistic babies.
That's very true.
You have an autistic child. I mean, you might have a 5-year-old, and you know that 5-year-old is really sensitive to noise, certain noises particularly, might be sensitive to touch, might have food sensitive, all these different kind of sensory things going on. That didn't just suddenly happen when they got their diagnosis. This has been happening since birth. So that baby is growing up with all this sensory invalidation unwittingly going on. You know, I am a prime example of this because I am really touch averse. It hurts when people touch me on skin to skin. Now, if you talk to my mom's got dementia now, but if you talk to her a few years ago, she would talk about a baby that every time he was handled, he would scream and cry. And eventually over time that stopped. And she thought that was just because the baby, me, got used to being handled. But I have another narrative that goes on there, which tells me that no matter what I did, I was going to get touched. And every time I was touched, I cried. So what happens when you cry? You get picked up, you get cuddled, you get your nappy changed, someone tries to shove a bottle in your mouth. So no matter what I did, I was going to get touched. And the only way to minimize it was to stop reacting to it.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say I wasn't feeling that. I wasn't feeling the pain of touch, but I had stopped reacting to it. So when you have a child that's going through all of that, and then they reach the age of 2, and suddenly you plonk them in this room full of other screaming children, that's going to be really overwhelming. That's going to be really difficult. So the reaction to that is burnout, is the overwhelm. The body becomes dysregulated on a grand scale, and then you start losing skills because the brain goes into protection mode, and it's like, I don't need that right now. I need all the energy from that one thing there, and I need to focus on keeping safe. So if I lose some words or if I stop talking, it doesn't matter because I can use that energy elsewhere in a much more efficient and better way. Now, that's obviously really an oversimplified way of talking about it, but I can see how that narrative works clearly. And it makes sense because I know as an adult that the same things happen to me now, that when I enter a period of burnout, I'm less able to communicate.
Yeah.
The other things happen to me so why wouldn't it have happened to me when I was a child? Of course it would. The same things happen through.
I've been nodding my head like anything, Kieran, because it just makes so much sense. And as a parent, I can absolutely agree with virtually everything you said when I think of my two. So now that was really useful. Just looking at our next question here, is there a typical age when young people reach burnout? We tend, if I think of our clients, we tend to see it at secondary school. And I think sensory has a part there because you think about the size of a secondary school and all the sensory, the noises, the smells, the lighting, everything. I could be totally wrong, Kieran. But that's one question we've had from a parent.
I don't think you're wrong at all. I think another thing that plays into that narrative is puberty, because puberty is, for any child, puberty is a complicated time anyway. But when you are autistic and you have spent, I don't know, say puberty really kicks in at like the age of 13. So you've spent 13 years, probably 7 of those years being in an environment where you've had to mask for all that time, and you've been invalidated on so many levels that you don't even know it's happening anymore. It's just there constantly as a part of your life. and social situations are difficult and complicated anyway throughout that period. And then you get to puberty where you've got hormones raging around your body. Everything just becomes exacerbated. You find that sensory issues become really exacerbated during puberty. And also, this is an interesting one, because I was actually talking to someone about this the other day. And as a man, this is something that would obviously never occur to me. But I was talking to an autistic woman, and she was talking about her periods and how that's a very similar experience in a shorter burst to what went on when she was going through puberty, because her time of the month comes and then sensory issues become massive, and everything's more loud, everything's more painful, everything's more uncomfortable, and all of those kind of things are going on, and life just becomes more complicated at that time. So during puberty, you spend 5 or 6 years in this just of horribleness and hormones and all of this horrible stuff. So that's probably why you see it in teen years more. And it would be interesting to know actually if it's predominantly more girls that you see during teen years as well, because of the tendency for a later diagnosis, you have extra years of trauma there that child is dealing with. Yeah. So they've carried things for a lot more, and then that complicates things a lot more as well. But that is not to say that I haven't seen much younger children in really kind of extreme burnout. And I think, it depends on the child. It depends on how safe their kind of family and home is and things like that. It depends how under the cosh they are at school. And in those kind of environments, it depends how conformist the environment around them is and all of those kind of things. So there's a lot of different things that can play into it. But generally, I'd agree in terms of children and young people, early to mid-teens is probably the biggest time, but also around those big transitions as well. Things like moving from primary up to secondary school, from secondary school to college to university. Those are really, really huge moments. And if burnout doesn't hit at those moments, it will hit maybe a couple of months afterwards, so that you might not associate it with the situation that they've just kind of been through. So it's about being aware of the things that are going on and kind of within our children, and recognizing that just because something happened 6 months ago, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not having a major impact now.
Yeah, and I think Donna and I can say we've both experienced that and continue to experience that actually. So yeah, that's really useful. You've answered the next one in those. So Donna, over to you.
Yes. Do you want a quick? I was going to say, do you want a quick drink, Kieran? You're talking away, you two. Make the most of it. Right, ready? So this next question came in from a professional, from a teacher, and they've said that they genuinely appear okay within the classroom. I think you've answered this a little bit earlier actually, but how can that teacher help them to show their true state, not the mask? And this is kind of what you touched on a little bit earlier, but to gain their confidence, because this teacher genuinely wants to help these young people be themselves.
So trust plays a major part in that, first of all. But again, it's not something that an individual person can take responsibility over and change, because they're in an environment. And when we talk about the environment, we quite often think, well, that's the room that we're in. But it's not just the room, it's the people, it's the communication, it's the behavior around them, it's the energy flying around the room. It's all of those things that can make an autistic child feel unsafe, on top of the sensory environment and, lights, sounds, all of those kind of things. But also recognizing there are other things that are going on as well, in terms of things like co-occurring conditions and stuff like that. And one of the biggest factors is I did a conference several years ago, which was for head teachers and Senkos. And I was in the middle of my talk, and I was talking about, I can't remember what I was talking about, but then I mentioned the word alexithymia. Mm-hmm. And I kind of looked up as I said it, and I saw all of these like frowns, like, what does that mean? So I completely, and I had this moment because I have this privilege where I understand and use words and terminology that other people might not know. And then I use it freely because it's things I talk about all the time. But I sometimes forget that other people might not know words like this. So I like stopped my talk in the middle of it and I was like, right, I'm going to ask you for a show of hands. Can you put your hand up if you know what alexithymia is? So there were 300 people in this room and there were about 4 hands went up. I was like, okay, really hard now. So I was like, my next question, can you put your hand up if you've ever asked an autistic child to fill out some kind of feelings chart? Every single hand in the room went up.
Yeah.
Now, for people that don't know, alexithymia, actually, it's looked upon now as mostly being related to trauma. There's lots of research kind of looking into that area now. Alexithymia is like the interoception of emotion. So interoception is where messages in your body don't get passed around very well. Like for some things they're great, for other things they might not be. For some things they're furiously great, and other things they're really not. You know, so I might not know if I need the toilet or something like that. Mm-hmm. So because my bladder and my brain, the messages get mixed up in between them. So alexithymia is like that with emotion. So I might be feeling an emotion in my body and in my brain. I might be happy or angry. Angry is a good example. But my conscious brain does not know that I am angry. So I might be slamming doors and stomping around and growling at people and what have you. And someone will come up to me and say, what's wrong? Why are you so angry? And I'm like, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. And it's not until someone points it out that then I'll start questioning it. And I'm like, well, I am slamming doors. What's going on here? Why am I? And I literally have to actively process and try and figure out. Now, sometimes that can be minutes. Sometimes that can be days. Sometimes it can be weeks. My wife hates it because, you know, like 3 weeks after she's told me that I'm being angry and I'm like, I'm not being angry. Why are you accusing me of this thing? 3 weeks later, I'll be like, I was angry and this is why I was angry. And, you know, so there's a disconnect sometimes between emotions and recognizing those emotions. Now, early research into alexithymia actually only pointed to about 25% of autistic people having alexithymia. But actually, when you engage in conversations in the community, it's pretty much everyone. Everyone has it to some extent, and that also works on a bit of a sliding scale because, ironically, when you are stressed, you can be more alexithymic and not know that you're stressed and alexithymic. You know, so it's this narrative that's really, really common amongst autistic people. Now, if you imagine you've got an autistic child walking into school, and they are met with this "How am I feeling today?" thing, and they're like, happy face, neutral face, sad face. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, but also that's a really difficult question to ask anyone, but especially someone who uses logic in the way that autistic people use logic, because nobody is happy, nobody is neutral, and nobody is sad. We feel lots of different things at the same time. You can be happy but still upset about something. You know, so it's a complicated question anyway, but becomes more complicated when you have no idea what your emotional state is and you don't know how to answer that question. So also that can become a problem in recognizing emotions in other people, because if you don't know what you're feeling, how are you ever supposed to know what somebody else is feeling? And if you don't make eye contact, which is a thing that nobody should be asking any autistic person to do, then as you grow up not making eye contact or masking and looking in between people's eyes or at their eyebrows or at the spot on the end of their nose or whatever it is that's going on, you're not paying attention to facial visual clues. And if your body language and physical expressions are different anyway, and you innately recognize that in other autistic people, but when it comes to looking at non-autistic people, you're like, I don't know why you're standing like that or what that means. All these things make it really, really complicated. And then it gets to the point where you're like, somebody asks you how you're feeling. You're like, do you really want to know? Because I'm going to give you 14 hours of how complicated all that is to answer. You know, but for autistic children, this is something that's expected that they learn, that it's expected that they do, because that's what everybody does. No, that's a really ableist narrative, because it's not what everybody does, because not everybody thinks and feels in the way that you do. And that's really
really interesting, Kieran, because we hear from a lot of parents where they've been told to use the 5-point scale with their children.
Don't get me started on that.
No, I know. I did wonder if you might say that, Kieran. We often give the same response, I suspect. And it's a similar thing, isn't it? How on earth can you expect a young person to be able to say that they're getting more angry when actually they don't know how they feel at all in the first place?
Exactly. I mean, just before I came on here, I'm in the middle of recording a talk about it's for the Anna Freud Centre about meltdowns, shutdowns, and burnout. And I was in the middle of talking about, I've lost what I was going to say. I hate when I do that. I go off on a tangent and then I lose it with like mid-sentence. What was I going to say? It will come back to me. Go with the next question. It will come back to me. Oh no, sorry, I've remembered. So it was about ABCs and behaviour. So if you are a parent and you go to CAMS because your child might be showing what you might think is challenging behaviour, and usually the narrative that's behind that is that you've not been supported to understand what's going on with your child properly, and they're going through emotional dysregulation and sensory dysregulation and causing all these kind of issues. But you go to CAMS and what they'll give you is an ABC chart, which is, so you have to look at the antecedent and then you look at the behavior and then you dissect all that afterwards and figure out what was going on. And then that's how we fix it. We know what's going on. But if you've got a child with all that complex stuff going on, how on earth are you as a parent supposed to pick that apart? And how is an ABC ever going to be good enough or in-depth enough to be able to support you to support your child? All these simplistic things like that, like the emotions charts, like the 5-point scale, all these things are too simplistic and they're really neuronormative. They're really focused on non-autistic people in the way that non-autistic people are supposed to think and feel. I don't know if they think and feel those ways. I don't really think they work for anybody. I don't think they explain anybody. I think they're really, really oversimplified for most people. But for autistic kids especially, these things are pointless, absolutely pointless. And they don't give you enough information because they can't, because they don't dig deep enough. And the narratives that support the use of these things don't have enough knowledge to be able to use them properly. It's just a waste.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, the next question was with the teacher about the common traits to look out for, but I think you've probably gone into quite amount of detail on the typical traits. There are no typical traits. Is it a case of a very careful, watchful eye, really get to know that child?
Yeah, it is. It's about building that relationship and building that trust. And I mean, like where I started with the previous question, which I probably didn't end on because I went off on a tangent, was about, that one person can't do everything. There's systemic change that needs to happen around that child in order for them to feel safe enough to be fully authentic. And what I meant to kind of touch upon briefly just before about, schools struggle to even match the learning styles of autistic children. So autistic people are monotropic. There's a theory of monotropism. If you want to Google anything, teachers, Google monotropism. Somebody might want to type that in the chat. So what monotropism describes is that autistic people are attention focused. So we need a hook. We need something to get our attention on. And then once our attention is on that thing, everything goes, thank you, Victoria, everything goes to that thing. Everything is about that thing. And this isn't just about what's pathologically termed as special interest. This could be anything. I could be doing the dishes and my attention is on those dishes. And I will do those dishes in as much detail. And if someone comes and interrupts me, it's like literally lifting myself out of a black hole. The gravity I'm fighting against to pull my attention away from that thing and refocus. Now that's a transition. Most people wouldn't recognize that as a transition, but it is a transition to shift your attention from one thing to the next. It's really difficult to do when you're autistic because of our monotropic neurology. So when it comes to learning, we need a hook. We need to be interested in what we are learning in so that we can just focus on that thing, and everything, our whole world then can encompass that thing. All our attention, our sensory system can readjust itself and regulate towards rushing towards this thing. So that might be, I don't know, if you are interested in Vikings and all of a sudden you're doing a topic on school about Vikings. So you're doing it in history, and the lesson starts, and here's your Viking lesson. This is the thing that you love and you want to talk about and you want to learn about and you want to educate other people about, and that's amazing. And then 45 minutes later you have to stop and you have to go to PE, and then 45 minutes later you have to go to English, and then 45 minutes later it's lunch. You can't get inertia. You can't get into a flow with anything. Now, that's how autistic people need to learn. Give us a topic, surround everything around that topic, a topic that we are interested in, and watch us run. Watch us flow. Watch us learn everything that we can possibly learn about that thing. If you can frame anything, any subject around a topic. So my daughter is a perfect example of this. So she is home educated. She has a maths tutor. Everything in her life is wolves. Everything. She plays a wolf game. She writes wolf stories. She play acts as a wolf. Everything is wolves. So her maths tutor has built her whole maths curriculum around wolves. There is this wolf world where these wolf families go out and do wolf shopping and buy wolf things and fill in their wolf cave. And we've worked out the measurements of their caves, all their individual caves, and where they can put things in them. So there's so many different things that you can just draw by using a one-word subject. But schools aren't built that way. Mainstream schools particularly are not built that way. They're built around lots of short bursts of really superficial information that are framed and have to be taught in a particular way. And that doesn't work for most autistic people, because that's not how our neurology works. So expecting us to be in an environment like that, just framed around that one thing, and to be happy and functional and authentic in that environment, it's not going to happen. It's absolutely not going to happen. This is why systemic change needs to happen as well. But if you have a child in a school environment and you can build that relationship with them, and you can do your best to break down the school day into as long lengths as possible, framed around things that you know that they're going to be interested in and are really going to grab their attention, that's how you get your authentic autistic child within a school environment. And then on top of that, you support peers. In autistic culture, you support the autistic child in non-autistic culture, and you frame all these things around them. And at the end of it, you have an autonomous, authentic, well-rounded, emotionally regulated autistic child. Find me the school that does that, and I'll give you £1 million.
And a very long waiting list, Kieran. Oh dear. So the next question we get asked, oh dear, we got lots of parents ask us the same question or around the same question, Kieran. How do you get professionals to listen when you're told that actually it's your parenting style, and they get referred on to courses that you know won't help, but you have to attend, or you attend anyway because you need to tick that box to say that you have done what's asked of you from a professional?
That's that much.
I know, it's a loaded question, that one, isn't it?
How do you get professionals to listen? Well, I would say the professionals that are sitting here right now listening to this are the ones that want to listen and want to learn, and are probably actively trying to be better and do better and remove the ableism from their service, and want to authenticate and validate autistic experience. I would hope that describes all of you, and that's why you're here. On an individual basis, as a parent, you can try to educate. You can go on my website, print off my blogs, and you can go and print research papers, and you can screenshot things and just leave things on people's desks and hopefully they'll pick them up and read them. You can actively try and get them to engage in new ideas. But what I would always do, the thing that I always do when I'm on a personal level, when I'm engaging in any kind of professional service or any kind of professional, is talk to them before we get onto the subject of whatever they're here for, is pin them down for 5 minutes and find out what they know, ask them leading questions, and then you will very quickly get a level of understanding of where their knowledge is at and how supportive they're going to be. I had a great kind of phone call with an OT, an NHS OT the other week regarding my daughter. where she phoned up to give me the kind of 1 hour triage screening appointment over the phone, and I ended up giving her autism training for the full hour. You know, so sometimes things like that have to happen because you have to reset that professional's knowledge. The problem is with lots of professionals is that, and this isn't all professionals, but this is a human thing really, is that often when we are first given a piece of information about anything, that's the bit of information that we always come back to. No matter what we learn afterwards that might contradict that and conflict with that, we always come back to that. So if you've got someone who was, I don't know, went for university in the late 90s, their level of knowledge and understanding will have moved on from there in some regards, but it will always get dragged. And that's called confirmation bias, and it's something that all of us do. And it's really difficult to knock that out of you and fill yourself up with new stuff. So the best professionals are the ones that are trying to do that, like the guys that are here tonight. But when you have that individual professional, sometimes there is nothing you can do and you have no control over that. And you have to jump through the hoops because you become caught up in a system which won't let you go. And often we find very quickly that we enter services and we enter systems, professional systems, and we don't want to be in them anymore because we know they're not going to help. And actually they're going to make our lives harder and more complicated, but we're stuck. Some people have the balls to be able to kind of stand up and say, no, I'm disengaging from all these services and having nothing to do with any of you. That works for some people. Others, then it causes further problems to do that. So it depends on who you are, how confident you are, and, you know, where you are within that kind of service and who you're dealing with. But it's so complicated a question that I wish I had the answer to it. Because if we had the answer to that, we wouldn't be here talking tonight. We might be talking about other things that are much nicer, and, you know, but we're not. We're here talking about a narrative that very few people understand and very few, even less services understand. So it's so hard, and my heart hurts for everyone who is stuck in this system because I'm coming from a place of knowing what it's like because I'm in it as well. And it's, you know, we're working actively. I've taken one of my children out of school because it wasn't right for her. But then that creates more problems because we live under a local authority where they don't believe in home educating. So they're on our necks all the time, you know, and we're having to prove what we're doing all the time, even though legally they can't ask for things, they still do. And there's pressure and threats and, you know, so unfortunately we live in a world that has been built to put barriers up in front of us repeatedly. So coming together like this and coming together in our communities and supporting each other through it and creating Facebook groups where you put templates of letters in and things like that and all those things, they're the things that help us navigate through. None of us are going through the same situations alone independently. There are other people that are going through exactly the same things as we are, and it's connecting with those people and making sure that they are as supportive of you as you are of them, and that you can work together and face these things collectively and not face them individually.
Yeah, no, I think that is crucial. And for us, you know, that's something we see and hear time and time again is, you know, the isolation, but we try to teach parents that your knowledge is there to empower others as well. You know, as you say, we are a community, and hopefully change will come when we all work together and change the systems and things. But my goodness, it's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to fight
it's, you know, it's without wanting to invalidate you guys. There are yous all over the country, aren't they? There are CICs and there are social enterprises and charities that are doing the same thing as you all over the country because there's such a need for it. And it's ridiculous. You shouldn't have to, as parents, go through this experience and then use that experience to set up something to support other parents who are going through exactly the same experience without it ever changing, because it doesn't really change. You're supporting people for the same situations that you went through. So nobody apart from you has learned anything from that. Yeah. And that's really hard when you are around systems that are, I've got this theory that when you look at the autism diagnostic criteria and you take the word autism out of it and you put society in it as its place, society is rigid. Society engages in repetitive behavior. Society engages in challenging behavior. You know, the whole autism narrative is a huge projection of what society is like. And then we have systems which just reinforce all of that. it's a mess. It all needs bulldozed down.
Yeah,
I
it
like
is.
that, Kieran. Yeah.
It is. It's really tricky, really difficult. I look at my eldest child, or it's not a child at all now, is 27. But there's not a lot that's different now to where there was when I was fighting these same systems and battles as I did then for him. And that's almost 30 years ago. It's madness, absolute madness. But I do think that there is more awareness. I do think that awareness has increased, definitely. But sadly, the system that parents are navigating still feels like there's many, many barriers and many hurdles to overcome.
Yeah. And I mean, as a 42-year-old who was undiagnosed at school, children now are going through exactly the same experiences, whether they're diagnosed or not, as I went through at school. So that's what, 30 odd years ago now, no, more than that. That nothing really has changed. And in a way, the school system's become even more difficult because it's become more conformist, more about exams and achievement and results and all that. There's more pressure now than there was even then. So I wouldn't want to be an autistic child within the school system now. So I think in some ways we have moved forward dramatically, and then in others we've gone backwards. And unfortunately, the ways that we've gone backwards, or at least stood still or not moved forward enough, they're the important ones, the really kind of important ones. They're the ones that need to change and really need to be dragged into 2021. And they're the ones that aren't. And there's so much that needs changing. But again, it's organizations like yours that provide that community and provide that kind of support. And then that peer support that comes from that. That's what's really important. And I think that's where the change will come from.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Eventually.
It leads on quite nicely, actually, Kieran, to our next question. And we know that this situation happened quite recently to a parent. So their question, what do I tell the Senko when they tell me my child needs disciplining and toughening up, and as a parent, that they are pandering to the child's needs? I think your response is the same as Donna and I when we heard it.
Do you want the honest answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please.
The answer is I would take my child out of that school now. And I know that's obviously a privileged thing because not everyone is in a situation where they can just do that. But I would be at the very least working towards taking my child out of that school. That is a Senko who is invalidating you as a parent, is invalidating your child's experiences. That veil of professionalism that we talked about earlier. So many teachers, and again, not disparaging teachers at all, but I do see so many teachers that put that veil up of, I am the professional, I know what I'm talking about, you're just a parent and you're the problem. I see that all the time, unfortunately. It's a narrative which is far too common. And I can hear from the way that the question's been kind of asked and framed that the venom that was in the question was probably in the response that the parent got. And I don't think you are ever going to change anyone that thinks like that. They will think like that till the day they drop dead, probably. And that's a real shame for them, but it's also a huge shame for the people that they are impacting. You know, a Senko is there to work effectively with disabled children.
Yeah.
Why are you saying things like that to a parent of a disabled child? That's wrong. Absolutely wrong. It was a horrible way to live and a horrible way to think. The whole resilience narrative, I don't know any human being on this planet that is more resilient than an autistic person, because the amount of crap that we have to go, and I'm talking about in terms of disability now, the amount of crap and invalidation that we have to go through, and the fact that for so many of us, we are told that we're not autistic enough, or that we're too autistic, or, you know, it's all wrapped around things like functioning labels and things like that, that, you know, you've got value, you're important because you're going to be able to contribute to society. So let's have this massive expectation of you. And then when you fail, that's your fault. Or it's that, you know, you've got no value because you're non-speaking or you're disabled in some physical way on top of being autistic. And then that means that you're never going to be able to contribute to society. You're going to be a burden. So we're just going to discard you. They're the two narratives that just swing around us all the time, constantly, constantly, constantly. And then you get teachers like that who are saying things like that. We exist in a world which invalidates us pretty much 99% of the time. Could we be any more resilient? We walk into schools like we've covered over and over and over, where the environment is attacking us literally all the time on multiple levels, and autistic children are making thousands of reasonable adjustments just to exist in that building without even being asked to, but yet they ask for something like, can I not wear this jumper because it's a bit scratchy? Or school shoes are really uncomfortable for me. Or I need to get up and move around for 10 seconds. Is that okay? And the teachers say, hold on a minute, we need to write that into a legal document and get it ratified by multiple different people before we'll even consider giving you that. It's a power imbalance, a massive, massive power imbalance. And that Senko there is absolutely representative of that power imbalance. And it's...
Kieran, just what you've said, we hear this every single day. Obviously, we work with clients, Monday to Friday, but about, reasonable adjustments, just as you said, about the uniform or how they need a movement, whatever. And it is a battle for that to be put in place. And as you said, we must have it in a legal document, a provision plan or passport, whatever they want to call it. And I can remember a few years back, actually, I don't think they're still teaching anymore, but the Senko, my son started at secondary school, and I can remember a conversation, I don't think I'll ever forget it, and she said to me, oh, don't worry, he'll grow out of this autism come year 8. And as soon as she said it, I thought, okay. He did get pulled out of that school after year 7, thankfully. Anyhow, moving on, and I just want to say there are some good Senkos out there. I'll say that as well. Obviously, we support families and we advocate for them and stuff, and we love it when we come across those Senkos who are in it for the right reason.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to say that. Next question. Why are schools so surprised when we've been telling them for years that my daughter is masking? And sadly, even after a complete shutdown in school, she is still not accepted, understood, or supported.
Again, it comes back to lack of education, lack of real fundamental education. And again, the education they do get comes from observationalist external perspectives. It's usually non-autistic people who write and deliver training to schools. And there are autistic trainers are a tenner penny, but struggle to get employment and to get people to buy their training. It's funny that, isn't it? And because it's all part of the same narrative. It's all that infantilization and invalidation and all plays into it. And we're not seen as competent enough to be able to speak for ourselves. And that's the problem. So when you get teachers like that, it's the same kind of thing. It's that lack of education. And I went through a similar thing with my youngest. They were in school. We knew that they were autistic from the moment they were born, very clearly, and but didn't get a diagnosis until they were 8. So 7. And up until that point, school did not want to put any changes in place. We need to know that she's autistic before we will do anything. And then the moment she got that diagnosis, I had a phone call from the teacher who said, well, now that she's got the diagnosis, we can start putting things in place, can't we? And I made it very clear that they've been breaking the law for years and that a diagnosis is not needed to make reasonable adjustments. It's a statement of need, not a statement of diagnosis. But that's one of the reasons she's not in the school system anymore. And I've got 3 children, and I do have to say I've got 3 children, and the eldest is very academic, struggles with the social aspect of school, as you would expect, that's very academic and finds the work easy, and they do work really hard to challenge him. My middle child is undiagnosed, is very, very autistic, but is one of those very autistic children that would struggle to get a diagnosis, and we have struggled with that. But he's not. I'm not saying he's not interested in school, but he's very hands-on and likes to do outdoor things, and he's very good with building stuff and stuff like that. And just goes to school and just breezes through and doesn't really care. And and we're not bothered, because we know he's going to go on and be like an amazing carpenter or something like that. And then my youngest is out of school because it was not right for her to be in school, and the systems around her were not. So, but there's privilege in us being able to take her out. And for any person that does home educate, it's a massive, massive decision. But it is something I do recommend lots of parents look into. And it's a huge lifestyle change, and it can have an impact on your finances and things like that. And, there's big decisions to be made there. But at the end of the day, what use are GCSEs to someone whose mental health is in the gutter and is potentially going to take their own life because of it?
Exactly.
We learn all our lives. I worked in education for a very long time. Then I worked in service provision for autistic adults. I was an administrator for a while. I was a stay-at-home dad. And I never dreamt, if you'd said to me 15, 20 years ago that this is what I'd be doing now, I would have laughed at you. I tanked my wedding speech because I couldn't public speak. And yet here I am talking to however many people are here. And, I talk to hundreds of people all the time and things like that. So, but that's because this is my passion. And, but people change jobs, people learn. People change all the time, and people are learning all the time. People access education at different parts of their life. But we are told that we have to go to school between 16 and do our exams at 16 and go to college and go to university. And if we don't do those things at that particular time, our life is going to be over. And it's not like that at all, and I wouldn't encourage anyone not to encourage their kids to go through their GCSEs, but I don't even remember what my GCSE results were. That's how meaningless they are.
And Kieran, I just want to say, actually, and this is the difference, because, my daughter has had a difficult journey with previous schools, but the one she's been at for 4.5 years is amazing. And the executive head teacher turned around, I remember a conversation we were having, because I just think she's fantastic. And exactly what you've just said, she said, who turns around to you and says, how old were you when you took your GCSEs? How old were you, if you took A levels or B Techs? She said, no one asks you. It doesn't matter when you take them, So, yeah. Next question. Do you feel there's any reason in particular that parental reports of masking are not believed? So we have this, and I can think of a few cases we're dealing with, actually. And they've even been to, certain hospitals, well-known hospitals, and seen, experts. You've got the school, and everyone, are saying no.
Why does that happen?
Frustrating for them.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to lack of education. And if you randomly dragged a professional off the street that happens to work with autistic children or adults and mention the words masking or camouflaging to them, they might they might recognize those terms, and they might be able to give you a superficial understanding of those terms, usually framed around this is something that we choose to put on when we enter a social situation, and then we navigate and take it off again, like I said before. But that's because masking is something that the autistic community have been talking about for decades upon decades, since the first of us got together back on the original internet servers back in like the late 90s and things. Those were conversations that had. I've got a book on that shelf behind me by Gunilla Gerlund, who was a Swedish autistic, that talked about masking. It was published in like 1994, I think it was. So this is something that has been talked about in the community for a long, long time. Research has only caught up with this in about the last 5 or 6 years, and already it has gone askew, because it's gone from, this is what the autistic community is talking about, to this notion of picking up this mask, choosing to put it on and then taking it off. And, that's how we navigate social situations. But it is so much more complicated than that, and so much more complex. And you find this in the autism narrative generally, that everything is superficial. Everything that's come from the professionals, from the celebrity experts and the celebrity academics and all, it's really, really superficial. There's no meat to the bones. They'll talk about these things and use these big words and explain things in a very kind of stereotypical and generic way. And actually, there's no substance underneath any of it. And that's because they've been missing the substance that comes from us. So it's only now, like I said, that autistic people have been really, really engaged, have stopped being the people being experimented and researched upon, but are actively steering the research and doing the research. Only really in the last 4, 5, 6 years that's really started to kind of take hold and change. The problem is with the research narrative, and this is related to the question, so forgive me if it sounds like I'm going on a tangent. The people that engage in research usually are parents and newly diagnosed people. And the reason for that is because both of those parties want something that's going to help them, and they feel like they're contributing to something that's going to help them. The problem is that parents are missing a massive chunk of the knowledge and the narrative, because all you've got is what you see and not necessarily what your child is experiencing. And newly diagnosed people, unfortunately, as much as they want to help and have just been handed this thing and are autistic, absolutely are autistic, but maybe haven't had the privilege of having access to all these different narratives that are going on around us. So their knowledge of autism is what's in the textbooks and what's in the cultural knowledge and what's in the media and films. And that's where it all that information comes from. So that's skewed what's in research, because it's uninformed people that have been contributing to the research narrative. And then you've got non-autistic researchers who are like, this is my knowledge of autism. What's going to fill my confirmation bias? I will ask questions or infer answers that feed my confirmation bias. So it makes things really, really skewed and superficial, and it's missing that meat. That's what slowly started to change over the last few years. And I think as we go into the next decade, I think it's really going to make a big difference. But that's what's happened with the masking narrative, because we've got a small group of people, of researchers who are focused on this narrative, who are doing research around it, and who are asking mostly newly diagnosed autistic people about masking. Now, those newly diagnosed autistic people have been masking for a very long time and have only just figured out that that's what's going on. So how do you have the experience of what it's like to not mask? How do you know what's masking and what isn't when you're wrapped up in doing it still in that moment, So there's lots of complicated things there. And really we need to talk to people about masking in ways which don't use those words and terms. How do you feel? How did you feel? What was your experience of this? Have things like this happen to you? So when we know that those things have happened, we know there's after effects of those things and what they contribute to. And then we start really digging into the nitty-gritty of it. Unfortunately, that's not where we are right now, and that hopefully is what we're going to change into doing. But this is where you come up with these narratives like only autistic girls mask. Yeah. And then researchers have heard this, have created this narrative themselves, and then have built upon that narrative by saying, well, there's a female autism phenotype, which means that there's a type of autism which is specifically for women. But the researchers have acknowledged that there are men that fit the female autism phenotype. So a man might go for a diagnosis and they'll say, well, you're not autistic, you're female autistic. And it's literally, that's where we are. It's ridiculous. And these narratives are contributed to by non-autistic researchers who are usually white, middle class, non-disabled, and who have massive amounts of privilege. The person who came up with the female autism phenotype, if you break that down into initials, that's an American term for something else, which is sexual. And it was thought up by a white, middle class, Cambridge-educated professor who's talking about women. When you put those things together, I'm sure that wasn't deliberate, but when you put those things together, there's that sexist narrative again. It's just there all the time. And there was a big thing on Twitter the other day about research. Sorry, I know you want to say something, but it was about research about autistic mice. There's lots of researchers that do laboratory research on mice and try to figure out if they're autistic or not and attach their behaviors to being autistic and things. And there is a certain type of mice in one of these research papers where they'd giving it a particular name around anxiety, and I can't remember what the initials stood for, but the initials were CUM. And then, you know, you've got these like white boys in laboratory conditions who don't access the real world and who are coming up with acronyms like that. It's just...
I actually saw that on Twitter, yeah. And you know what I was going to say, Kieran, exactly what you were saying, and you know, different services, you know, people have good intentions and they want to try and improve things for families and young people. However, when they have, you know, the consultation and those people who are inputting on how that's going to shape and how it's going to be rolled out, is absolute, just like the research, it's getting the right people, and that's what I find so frustrating. And there's a recent thing, you know, Donna would tell you I've been ranting for ages about it, because it is so important, like anything, to have the right people, you know, around that table, inputting and shaping things to truly improve services going forward.
Yeah, and that's, again, I'm not breaking any confidences here. Someone forwarded an email to me this morning, which was from my local authority to a provider service, a charity, a local charity, and my friend is very much in the running of that charity. And it was talking about, we have this autism provision board at the local authority who make decisions about autistic people and what we need and the services that we deserve. And they are a bunch of professionals. None of them are autistic. They're mostly white as well, so they're not even reflective of a portion of society, you know. And they sit and they come together once a month and they talk about autistic people and make decisions about autistic people without engaging with autistic people. And they, in the last month, had worked together to come up with a definition of what a thriving autistic person would look like. Their understanding of what a thriving autistic person would look like, without engaging with any autistic people whatsoever. And they had asked my colleague if at the next meeting she could bring along one of her service providers to comment on their definition.
Are you going along?
No. I sent her, had the last 3 weeks with a certain professor not gone on, I probably and I've been there before and I have spoken at their meetings and I've told them exactly what I think of them. And they don't like it very much. They don't like me very much, but I would have done, but I literally wrote a very sweary statement and sent it to her. And then I wrote one with the swear words taken out and sent it. And I said, please read this. I said, I haven't got the spoons to come and stand in front of them and rip them a new one, especially knowing that they won't even care or listen. But I want them to know how awful and horrific it is and unprofessional that they think that this is acceptable. They wouldn't think it was acceptable for a bunch of men to be standing around making decisions about women. They wouldn't think it was acceptable, hopefully wouldn't think it was acceptable for a bunch of white people to be making decisions about black people without including black people or having black people leading the conversation. So yeah, but this is the state of, and that's not to say that every local authority is like this, but I'm afraid that most of them are. And some are working really hard to try and change that. And I know that there are people within local authorities up and down the country who are really trying to effect change, but again, are coming up against groups like that who just control and won't relinquish their control and won't see that they're the problem.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh gosh,
we've got about 11 minutes, so choose your questions, your last ones carefully.
I was just thinking, we've got 37 messages.
You can always do this again.
Yes, I
30
think
of the
it was.
messages
talk
in
a
the
lot.
chat that we've not even looked at. Okay, which ones do we go with? All right, let's quickly zip through. What can I do to encourage my child not to mask when she is staying with the other parent? Now, this is particularly in relation to separated or divorced, parents, and the other parent doesn't believe that the child is autistic. And we hear this sadly
So do I.
quite frequently. And then, of course, the child comes back to the parent who is the support and safety network, and the child is then in meltdowns and probably a bit of burnout going on, and it takes them all those days to rebuild themselves, and then they're going back to the other parent again.
Yeah.
I know. We haven't really got an answer either.
I hear this all the time as well. I think, and unfortunately, usually it's dad that's the problem. And that's not me being sexist. It is usually dad.
Yeah, that is our experience as well.
It's so hard, and especially when I would imagine usually the case in situations like that, it hasn't been a nice divorce. It hasn't, the relationship and on every level has broken down. There's no kind of real kind of communication going backwards and forwards, and there's probably a lot of anger and heavy emotions going on. Unfortunately, as long as that child wants to keep spending time with the other parent, I don't think there's a lot you can do about it. Particularly when the other parent is unwilling to learn and listen and understand, that makes it all the more complicated. One thing to consider is, and I hate doing this, but if you've got an autistic child in the family, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And unfortunately, usually dad is the one that mum goes, it'll be them. This comes from them. This comes from their side. It's all dad. It's all that. And usually that's because of those sexist narratives where women don't recognise themselves. But with the case of being dad, a lot of terms are often thrown around things like narcissism and stuff like that. And this isn't me trying to excuse anybody's behaviour whatsoever. But if dad is autistic and doesn't know, dad has been hard masking for decades. And quite often when people are like that, and it isn't all autistics, because some autistics, the moment you kind of put things in front of them, they're like, oh yeah, that really makes sense. But for some of us, when you hold up a lens of autism, like hold up a mirror to that person, their mask is so hard ingrained that it's like, nope, not looking at that. And they will push that as far away from themselves as possible. So when they're seeing their child and probably recognizing parts of themselves in that child, as all of us do as parents, then those things that mum or whoever else it is has assigned, saying, well, that's they're autistic and this is why they're doing things in those ways, that other parent is going to be like, nope, not having any of that, because that's too close to home. So the difficulty is then, what do you do in that situation? If the relationship has any kind of integrity whatsoever between the two parents, that will be the time where I'll be saying, print off some blogs and just leave them lying around and let them come to it in their own time. Start dropping some hints and things and start talking about things that the children do that are like mum or dad or whoever, but don't use the word autism. Don't say that they're autistic things, or don't say that that's because they're autistic or they're, they're autistic themselves. You can talk about autism without talking about autism. And you can that will help hopefully encourage that other parent to kind of like, well, I do that and that's okay. It hasn't got this negative word assigned to it that I deem as negative anyway. And start building up kind of that recognizable trust between parent and child. And then the more parent recognizes that there are things happening to their child and that their child is doing things that they recognize from themselves, the more established that kind of emotional bond is going to be. But within all that, the child is masking around that parent because they don't feel safe. They're not able to emotionally connect to that parent in the way that they need to in order to help them feel safe. And that is always going to be a problem until that parent figures out themselves. So there is probably very little you can do to change that situation, but support the child, help the child to understand themselves, help the child to understand their own sensory needs, give the child help the child get confidence in advocating for themselves so that they can start saying no, encourage that child to have boundaries with adults and with other people, and help them to say no to other people so they don't feel like they have to fawn around that parent or project that acceptable version of themselves around that parent. And you will probably find very quickly that that child will realize that that person's not safe and I shouldn't be near them, and then will choose not to, and then might go back at a later date when they feel more in control of themselves. So it's, you know, that's a simplistic way of looking at it, but it's such a complicated thing that I wish again that I had a magic wand and I could fix. But there are so many narratives around this that are complicated and difficult, and it's very easy and quick to blame other people for their behavior without realizing that there's so much going on underneath, and a lot of that is trauma. And that's really hard. And dad will have trauma and mum will have trauma, and all of that is kind of mixed up in everything and just makes everything so difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it you know, there's the added complications when there's court cases and, you know, all sorts going on, and it really does become, you know, a fight between parents, whether one wants that or not. You know, it just is, it's very difficult for families in those situations. Yeah. Sarah, did you want to ask your last question?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we can have a quick fire round.
I was just going to say, Kieran,
One word answers.
Well, if you could give one piece of advice for parents and one for professionals working with young people who mask, what would it be?
I'll start with professionals because that's the easier answer. Get yourself trained by autistic people. Get autistic people working within your services who understand these narratives. That doesn't mean go and drag anybody off the street, but make sure that you get autistic people working within your services, consulting to you, helping you write the training, delivering the training with you, co-producing, and go out and find modern research to inform your skill base. Go out and watch things like this. There are so many autistic people that do live webinars and Facebook Lives, and Academy is a great one for that. Every Saturday night, 7 or 8 o'clock, I think it is, they have a webinar with an autistic professional talking about different topics every single week. It's free education. It costs you nothing, but it's going to help inform you. So, and thank you, someone's put my website as well. Come on, my training is okay. You know, so so for professionals, that's what I would say. You need to embed yourself in autistic culture and surround yourself with autistic people, knowledgeable autistic people who get these narratives. And for parents, I said that was the easy one for professionals. Parents are harder in terms of, as long you can only control what you can control. As long as you are helping your child to be as authentic as they possibly can, to encourage them to have boundaries with other people and give them the power to say no to other people, to help them to understand themselves, to introduce them to autistic culture through spending time with other autistic people, whether that's children of their own ages, older people, whatever. Help them with support them through their interests, all of those kind of things, and help them understand their sensory needs. If you do those things, generally, obviously it's more complicated, but simplistically, generally, that's going to help you have someone who has good mental health, is well regulated, and is able to advocate their own needs. And that's what you want. That's all you want for a child. That's all you want, for them to be authentic and autonomous. And we think about autonomy like it's, that means they have to do everything by themselves. Autonomy isn't that. Autonomy is independence of choice. Autonomy is being able to say, this is what I need and this is how I need it, whether I can do that myself or I need someone to help me, and having choice over all those things. If you can encourage that within your child, these are the things that we, all of us, autistic or not, needed to be given when we were children. I bet all of us have problems with as adults, have relationship problems, have people in our lives who are like leeches and suck the energy out of us that we wish we had stronger boundaries with. All of these things are things that we need to be equipped with. And these are all the things we don't give children. And they're the things that need to start happening. So if you can do that at home and you create a safe bubble that they can learn to take with them to places and give them choice and control, you will end up with a well-rounded young adult.
Fantastic, Kieran. Donna, did you want to? We are dead on time, so unfortunately, I know we've got loads of comments. Should we just quickly look at the first
Some of
one?
them are comments as Kieran's been talking. There are two that have jumped out to me in particular from autistic adults that I think may benefit, Kieran, if you've got a couple of minutes
Sure.
to run over, or do you want to go? It's fine if you do.
No, it's fine. Hang on.
Okay, thank you. So one of these says, I've learnt to mask by trial and error, and now I'm fairly good at it. Problem is that now colleagues don't believe that I'm autistic, and that leads to problems with acceptance and sometimes adjustments that I might need. Should I continue to mask?
That's a hard question. As long as you have control over it, and as long as you are managing it and managing your energy levels, if you feel it is more beneficial for you to do that and it keeps you safer, then that's your choice. But yes, if you feel you are in a situation where you have no choice but to do it, I would say that you are in an unsafe situation and you need to talk to your employers. This is going to sound very twee of me to say so, because there are laws that can protect you around employment and reasonable adjustments. Reality is we know that doesn't always happen, but it's very much dependent on who your employer is and what relationship you have with them. So it comes down to your choice, really. It comes down to whether you are in a if you have supportive employees, but it's your colleagues that you have the issue with, then you need to talk to your employers. If you feel that you are better off keeping on doing it and you can manage that without harming yourself, then, feel free to continue to do so. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it does come back to, if you are choosing to be there and choosing to be like that, then that's okay, because that's your choice and it's an informed choice. If you feel like you have no choice, something needs to change there, because it's going to get, as you get older, I'm 42. I'm not old in the grand scheme of things, but I know that my body is not as good as it was. And I know that it's harder to do things, and recovery from stuff takes longer, particularly around social kind of stuff and being around other people. It takes a lot longer for me to recover now. So I know that's only going to get worse as I get older. So I have to learn to manage that. And if you and your employment aren't able to manage that, because it's just going to get harder and harder, so something will have to give somewhere. So I wish I could tell you what to do. I wish I could.
That's a difficult one.
It's that magic word again, but magic wand. Sorry, but yeah, it's so hard, and I'm so sorry, because I've been in those situations. I've been there. I've been in jobs where literally have disclosed in jobs and have been told to my face that I was a liar. So it's so hard, and I do feel for you. I'm so sorry.
And the second question is pretty much a similar thing. Do autistic adults, or people who believe that they may be autistic, very good at masking, etc., do they explain this to potential employers in a job interview? Because this person's worried what will happen to them in their job, currently a university student, but experiences panic attacks at the end of a social day.
My advice is always put it on the application form to start with. When they ask, do you have a form of disability, whatever, my advice would be put it on there. Because if you get an interview, then they've read that and they can't say otherwise. If you do end up getting a job and they do end up treating you not very nicely, you've got evidence that you disclosed that right from the start. It's also telling as well, because as much as it's illegal to discriminate against people on application forms if you disclose a disability. It does happen, and it happens fairly regularly. So usually if someone's accepted your application form, then that would say to me that at the very least they are open to having autistic employees.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that I would bring up at an interview if it's not brought up, because it's important, because it's who you are. And there are potentials down the line that, because of the innate way that you communicate, that it might cause problems with other people because they don't like the way that you communicate. So your employer needs to understand that there are potential culture clashes that might happen at some point, or that there are periods where you need communication in a certain way and others aren't giving it to you. So these are conversations that really need to be had. And if you're at interview, that conversation, they're willing to have that conversation, then I would say absolutely, that's another excellent tick. That's a 10 out of 10 kind of thing. Get a gut feeling. And I know it's really hard because you don't want to be picky and discriminate about who you work for. You just want a job and you want the money. But also it's got to be the right place for you. And there is no point in accessing a place of employment that's going to treat you badly, because all that's going to do is scar you and make you more anxious and more likely to be wary about other employees. And then you end up drifting in and out of jobs, or not able to even find a job because you're so worried about who's going to take you on and how they're going to treat you. I would have to say, with the condition, that there is a reason that many autistic people go into self-employment. Because literally we have a career littered with things like that.
Yeah.
And that's not to scare anyone, but it is a reality of the world that we live in, that employment is really, really complicated, and there are many, many people out there who are not only not able to understand, but also unwilling to bend as well.
And a positive experience on that, with my son, when he was looking for a weekend job to help him save to go off to uni, and he's still working. It's a well-known high street chain of shops. And I remember having that conversation with him when he was completing the application form. Do I put it on there? And we discussed it, and I said, that's your decision, but I personally would, but you've got to think, so he did. He said, yeah, I am who I am. And he got an interview, and the manager brought it up straight away and said, okay, could you explain to me, how does that, impact you? How does it affect you, so I can understand? So my son did. And he said, that's really interesting, because actually I think my wife is on the spectrum. You move forward over 2 years, but that manager helped him get the transfer to where he is now, and they've actually become good friends. And that was, like you said, when you disclose it and then you have the interview and they actually ask you to explain it and educate them so they can understand how to support you, I think that speaks volumes about that company and that manager.
I mean, even the way that, firstly, in order to, when you bring it up, it's really important that you understand yourself. Because how then can you explain something to other people if you don't really, if you tangibly can't grasp what's going on with yourself? You need to really that's something to work on before you even get to that stage of looking for jobs. Understanding your own sensory needs, being able to articulate how you communicate in whatever form that is, and all of those kind of things, so that you can walk into that environment and be able to confidently able to explain it, or have like a transcript or something written down to describe different aspects of things and figure out some of the reasonable adjustments that you might need and stuff. But any good employer will probably say to you, if you disclose it at an interview, will say, right, we're not going to have this conversation right now, because we're going to look at you on the basis of, are you capable of doing the job, and do we think you're good enough, and so on and so on. But when it comes to it, we'll have a chat. If we offer you the job, we'll have a talk then about what adjustments you might need and stuff like that. A good employer would do something like that. But also with the caveat that when you're talking about things like reasonable adjustments, and when you're explaining how you are and how you work and those kind of things, that the employer understands that any reasonable adjustments that are in place are a movable feast. It's a working document that can be added to and taken away, and those things are taken away on your choice, because so often I hear about reasonable adjustments that are given for employees, and then when they don't use them, the employer removes them. But sometimes all we need is a safety net. Sometimes all we need to know is that there is something that's going to catch us if we fall. We might not ever use it, but it's there. And then, and that's enough. So it's having that relationship with your employer, and you will know when you go to interview in your gut whether they're good people or not, and whether they're going to be affirming and validating people, because any employer wants the best out of their employee in terms of they want them to have good mental health. They want them to have good physical health, because that means they're productive and they're going to be there.
Yeah.
So they don't want to take people on. And they shouldn't want to take people on and treat them badly, because they're a commodity. Your employees are a commodity. They make you money. They make your business work better, or they make your service work better, or whatever. So you have to treat them well. So you will get that in your gut when you go for interview, and when you look at the stuff that they put out, and when you go and have a tour around the building or whatever it is, you will know that. You will feel that. You will get a feel for it. So listen to your gut. That's the biggest bit of advice I can give anyone. Just listen to your stomach.
We say that all the time, don't we? That was
Yeah.
well, my mum used to always say it to us when I was little.
We're taught not to, though, aren't we? We're conditioned to not listen to our own gut. We're conditioned to listen to other people and fall into what other people expect of us and things. And we should listen to ourselves more.
Definitely, couldn't agree with you more. Kieran, I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been fantastic.
Thank you
and
for
really
listening.
insightful.
Yeah, and I hope we haven't scared you off too much, and we can work together again very soon.
I'd like that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Really
Thanks,
appreciated, Kieran.
Lots of comments in the chat saying thank you as well.
Yeah, really positive.
This one, I think, just summarises it all for me. Thank you, Kieran, so much for sharing your knowledge and experience. Thank you, ladies, for organising this. I'm currently helping my mother, who is in a mental health hospital, who has masked all her life and is doing so in hospital with staff who have no idea how to help her. This has been really insightful. Many thanks to you all.
That's very personal and very privileged for you to share that, because actually that's a similar situation to what I'm in. My mum's in a care home at the moment and has been through some awful experiences in care. She's undiagnosed and they just don't have a clue. And she's got dementia and she can't advocate for herself. So
it's not
thank you, Kieran.
It's been a pleasure. Genuinely, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think we can speak for everybody. Thank you so much.
Hope to see you soon, Kieran. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, Kieran. Bye, everyone. Bye.